Remember last week how he just showed up in that locked upper room where the apostles had gathered for fear, and his presence transformed them with his peace. And then Thomas, with all of his concerns and doubts and his stubbornness, was changed by the physical presence of Christ. Well, this week, we're not going to be losing that theme as we find two disciples leaving Jerusalem on Easter Sunday. And they're walking out of the city, downcast, upset, gloomy. And their lives are changed again by the presence of Christ. Now think about it, friends. These guys are leaving Jerusalem on Easter Sunday. In one sense, they've turned their back on what God was doing. They're leaving the epicenter of where all the most incredible things in human history are happening because they're not quite sure that they have anything to do with it. They're not quite sure what's going to be happening or what's going on. I don't want to be too hard on them because I wasn't there, but it's a stunning picture of two of Jesus' disciples, two people that were close to the scene, turning their backs on Easter Sunday and walking away. Now, we know one of them was Clopas, and it's curious because we don't know the name of that second journeyer, and yet a lot of people think that because Mary of Clopas' wife, was actually at the cross, that second figure may have in fact been Mary, who witnessed Jesus' death. And so as they're walking out towards Emmaus, the story begins that it says that Jesus drew near and walked with them. Friends, I hope that you're beginning to capture, as I am, that God is incredibly humble. Here it is on Easter Sunday, two disciples, one of which doesn't even get named, and they're just walking through the wilderness, walking away from Jerusalem, walking away from all that God is doing. And he comes alongside of them and walks with them. And friends, no matter what's happening in your life today, or in the lives of anyone you love, God is always willing to walk alongside of us. It's reminiscent of the Garden of Eden. Remember when Adam and Eve ate the fruit and their eyes were opened and all of a sudden they were living in shame? It says that God walked up to them. He found them as God walked through the garden in the cool of the day. And as Jesus comes up to them, notice what he does. He comes right into their midst and he says, "What are you talking about?" And again, we've talked about this before. I would expect Jesus to be proclaiming things, to be announcing things, to be celebrating his glory, or at least the glory of the Father. And instead, he just comes humbly up to these two gloomy followers, and he says, "What are you guys talking about?" Remember Mary, he said, "Why are you weeping?" You get the sense that here we are in isolation, and Jesus may be coming up to us even now and just saying, what is it you need to tell me? What's happening with you? And the scriptures tell us that they paused, and you can imagine them maybe kicking their feet in the dirt, and it says that they were downcast. And friends, I'd like to take a moment there and just talk about our own emotional condition, because even as we are buying into this idea of isolation and quarantine, and perhaps beginning to see some things emerging, without exception, each one of us is experiencing these losses. And friends, it doesn't matter if what you've lost may seem or feel relatively minor, if it's a Little League season, or a graduation, or a wedding that was delayed, or a ceremony, or just the time with friends and family, or maybe it was something more tragic, something larger, the loss of a loved one, or the concern because someone has been sick or isolated or away from you. Each one of us, every single person, is experiencing this loss. And in one sense, friends, I want to just take a moment as we have this universal experience of this emotional condition from this virus to give us permission to identify those emotions. In many respects, as we do emerge and perhaps we begin to reopen, many of us will be experiencing some of the symptoms of PTSD. I think about Mary of Clopas, Clopas' wife. Yes, Easter Sunday was real and she was walking with Jesus, but so was Friday. And she witnessed the torture and the murder and the execution of one of her friends. And friends, this is so great about Easter spirituality. It does not ignore the reality of the suffering of humanity or our emotional condition. It walks with us. It embraces us. It moves us through it. So friends, just as a thumbnail sketch, some of the emotions we may be experiencing as we're in this quarantine and moving from it is that we may ourselves begin to emotionally avoid things. We may feel a bit more disconnected. We might be consumed by some negative thoughts. There might be a feeling of detachment or even numbness. We might have a lack of energy or interest in things that we previously cared about. You know, I spoke to a friend of mine, a beautiful priest, Father David, down in Long Island in Nassau County, where this virus has been so horrifying. He said that the vast majority of his parishioners and friends, they can't sleep. And so a sleeplessness from that anxiety can come into us. We may be experiencing irritability or outbursts of anger. And I just want to let us know that while these apostles, these disciples were gloomy, we're going to be affected emotionally by this too. And friends, that's okay. That's part of humanity. That's part of the experience. So be aware of yourself and others. Now, the irony of what these disciples actually say to Jesus is so striking we have to pause. They start their answer when he says, "What are you talking about?" They say, "Are you the only one here who doesn't know what's been going on around here the last couple of days?" And it's so rich. It's so rich because we'd expect at that moment that Jesus would then turn to them and say, "Friends, it's me. What do you mean I don't know what's going on? I'm Jesus. I died. I rose from the dead." But he doesn't. He says, "What things?" He draws out from them because in their emotional condition, in their sense of loss and confusion, he is humbling himself to listen. And friends, that's going to be what we all need more and more. We're going to need to listen to one another. That presence, that careful, focused, active listening is going to be so therapeutic as we emerge and we reopen from this pandemic. And the incredible irony of Jesus standing in front of them as they begin to talk about everything they knew about him. And friends, it turns out that they had great information. You know, a lot of what they knew about Jesus was right, that he had done incredible things and that they were really expectant that he might be the Messiah of Israel. And so they had such hope and energy, but then he was killed. And so they lost all of that hope. And they even report that this morning they had heard stories about Jesus maybe being resurrected or the tomb at least being empty. And so friends, they had all this information, but they had no understanding. And listen, we live in the era of information. If there's something you don't know, you can Google it. You can ask Siri. You can learn it on YouTube. You can get all the information points that you want about anything. But you know what it doesn't give any of us? It doesn't give us understanding. Information has in many ways become our God with a little g, and yet it doesn't solve problems for us to simply have information. And so we can oftentimes become lost. It could be like you have all the pieces of the puzzle, but you don't have the box top. And so you don't know how these pieces fit together. This pandemic feels very much that way as we watch our local and state and national leaders grappling with information, and yet perhaps they lack the wisdom of how to put it all together. And so Jesus takes over and he begins to address their biggest need. And he begins to unpack for them what it was that the scriptures, all the way from Moses and through the prophets, the entirety of the Psalms, I'm sure, a lengthy mountain hike with a Bible study with the Son of God as he describes himself to them through the scriptures. And it's a moment of divine revelation. And it changed them forever. They not only got to see the box top, they were living in the box top. And it was an incredible moment for them. And as they begin to gain that understanding and that divine revelation, what happened? Their mood changed. Their emotions were reset. As they gained that perspective, first from Jesus listening and then from him explaining, things began to change. And one element of what I'm sure Jesus explained to them that they may have been missing was that suffering was a part of being the Messiah. Whether he stopped there in Psalm 22 or he spent time in the suffering servant passages from Isaiah, I'm sure that they were shocked and then transformed to learn that the Messiah, the King of the Jews, the one that was anointed, would suffer. Friends, how critical is it for us to learn that when God became human, he suffered. Suffered is a part of humanity. And though I spend my entire life trying to avoid it and do everything I can do to protect the people I love from suffering, it's not possible. It's not human. When God became human, he suffered. And it is actually through his suffering that he saved us, that we might be the most human we could possibly be. And so in this pandemic, in these days of isolation, we're suffering. And friends, it's because we're human, and it's okay. And it's not surprising to us that in our humanity we suffer, but we can have solidarity if we suffer together. And so Jesus' Bible study, his explanation of who he is to them, that divine revelation, that sense of understanding, it transforms them and it shifts their emotions. They go from speculating about what might be or what may have happened to knowing and to understanding. It's Jesus' presence and his revelation that changes them. We know that they were changed because after they had their eyes opened through seeing him in the bread and understanding his presence with them, it says, were not our hearts burning when we listened to him on the road? People's hearts burn when they experience the presence of God, especially his revelation through the scriptures. My challenge to us, friends, is this. Let's be aware of our emotions. Let's make sure that we're not just telling others how we feel, but let's tell Jesus about what we feel, about what we're seeing, about what we understand. Let's just be honest with him. Let's take a walk with him. But then, friends, expose your life to the scriptures. Spend time each day and make sure you hear his voice. All the data and information that we're taking in right now, it's meaningless if we don't have the voice of the one who can knit it together. And there's a chance that if we hear his voice and we hear our own name in the story, we're going to go from being simply in a state of shock and disruption and calamity and gloominess. There's a chance that the voice of the one who knit us together in our mother's womb will change all those things. And we ourselves will return back in the direction we ought to be headed, running back into Jerusalem, banging on the apostles' doors, and letting them know that Jesus Christ, in fact, is risen. That death is not the final answer. That yes, suffering is a part of the human experience, but it's not the final word. There is life after death. There is beauty in the midst of and after suffering. There is glory in self-sacrifice, and there is love for all of us.